The ocean is a vast, unforgiving void. For centuries, sailors have spoken of the sea as a living, breathing entity, one that demands respect and occasionally exacts a terrible toll. When a ship goes down in a violent storm or is taken by hostile forces, it is a tragedy. But it is a tragedy that makes logical sense. We understand the destructive power of wind and waves. We understand the greed of pirates. But what happens when the sea spits a ship back out? What happens when a massive vessel is found drifting aimlessly in the dead of night, completely intact, with the engines idling and the lights extinguished? No distress signal, no signs of a struggle, just an oppressive, heavy silence. The ocean hides its secrets well, but sometimes the things it leaves floating on the surface are far more terrifying than the things it swallows whole. Welcome back to Nightfall War Stories, and tonight we are unsealing a naval dossier that has been buried in the archives for decades. The Strait of Malacca is one of the most vital, heavily congested shipping lanes on the planet. Stretching between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, it is a maritime highway that sees thousands of vessels pass through every year. Historically, it is also a notorious hunting ground for modern-day pirates. In the late summer of 1982, an Indonesian Navy fast attack craft was conducting a routine nighttime patrol near the northern sector of the strait. Their mission was standard: intercept smugglers and deter piracy. However, the vessel they encountered that night was not a pirate skiff. It was a massive, unregistered commercial freighter drifting silently in the dark. The following account was compiled from the declassified debriefing transcripts of the tactical boarding team that stepped onto that ghost ship. What they found in the claustrophobic dark corridors of that vessel defies all maritime logic and remains one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries of the sea. The night of August 14th, 1982 was exceptionally dark. A thick, suffocating marine layer had rolled in, blanketing the Malacca Strait in a heavy fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. The sea was unnaturally calm, resembling a flat sheet of black glass. Patrolling these waters was a naval fast attack craft under the command of Lieutenant Commander Tariq. His crew was seasoned, accustomed to the grueling hours and the constant vigilance required to police the strait. Shortly after 0200 hours, the ship's radar operator picked up a massive contact dead ahead. The object was not moving. It was not broadcasting an identification signal, and it had no navigation lights illuminated. It was a massive, silent shadow lurking in the fog. Commander Tariq ordered the patrol boat to approach with extreme caution. As they cut through the mist, the colossal silhouette of a rusted, mid-sized commercial freighter loomed over them. The name painted on the hull was heavily corroded, but it vaguely read MV Malacca Star. Tariq attempted to hail the vessel on multiple marine VHF radio frequencies. Unidentified vessel, this is an Indonesian naval patrol. You are adrift in a primary shipping lane. Respond immediately. The only answer was the cold hiss of radio static. Assuming the ship had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure and the crew was either incapacitated or being held hostage by pirates, Tariq authorized a tactical boarding. A 4-man team was assembled. Lieutenant Bima, the squad leader, Petty Officer Arif, the communications specialist, Corporal Sino, the heavy weapons specialist, and Private Yudi, the team medic. Armed with assault rifles and heavy tactical flashlights, the team boarded a rigid inflatable boat and made their way to the silent freighter. The side of the hull was slick with sea moss and algae. Using a grappling hook and a rope ladder, they silently climbed up to the main deck. The moment their boots touched the rusted steel deck, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. The air around the ship was noticeably colder than the tropical ambient temperature. There was absolutely no sound, no hum of generators, no vibrations from the engine room, just the eerie, hollow groaning of the ship's metal hull settling in the water. Lieutenant Bima signaled his men to fan out and secure the exterior decks. They moved with practiced precision, sweeping the port and starboard flanks. The lifeboats were completely intact and securely fastened to their davits. There were no bullet holes in the bulkheads, no bloodstains on the deck, and no signs of forced entry. The physical integrity of the ship was perfect. "Command, the exterior is secure. 0 contacts," Bima whispered into his radio. "We are making entry into the primary superstructure, proceeding to the crew quarters and the mess hall." The team pried open a heavy, watertight iron door and stepped into the pitch-black interior of the ship. The air inside was stagnant and smelled heavily of ozone, rust, and something faintly sweet and rotting, like decaying seaweed. Their flashlight beams pierced the darkness, illuminating narrow, claustrophobic corridors lined with exposed pipes and electrical conduits. They navigated the labyrinthine hallways down to the second deck, arriving at the mess hall. Bima slowly pushed the door open, his rifle raised. The room was completely empty, but it was what they found on the tables that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. Laid out on the metal dining tables were plates of partially eaten food, bowls of rice and fish stew, cups of black coffee. Medic Yudi stepped forward, shining his light on one of the coffee mugs. He reached out and touched the ceramic surface. He recoiled instantly. "Lieutenant," Yudi whispered, his voice trembling. "The coffee. It is still piping hot. The bowls are radiating heat. Whoever was sitting here was eating less than 10 minutes ago." A profound, chilling silence fell over the team. A commercial freighter of this size required a crew of at least 20 to 25 men. If they were eating just minutes prior to the boarding, where did 20 men vanish to on a ship completely surrounded by open water? There were no splashes heard. The lifeboats were still attached. Suddenly, Petty Officer Arif held up a clenched fist, signaling for absolute silence. He tilted his head toward the ceiling. From deep within the ship's ventilation shafts directly above their heads, they heard a sound. It was not the scurrying of a rat. It was a slow, deliberate, metallic dragging sound, like something incredibly heavy pulling itself through the narrow, galvanized steel ducts. "They are in the vents," Seno muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. "Pirates?" Bima shook his head slowly. "No man could fit in a duct that small. We need to check the engine room. If the crew is hiding, they would secure themselves in the lowest decks. Move out." Descending into the bowels of the ship was like walking down the throat of a dead leviathan. The deeper they went, the colder it became. By the time they reached the subdeck leading to the engine room, their breath was visible in the air, pluming into white clouds. This was a geographical impossibility. They were in the middle of the Malacca Strait in August. The temperature deep inside an unventilated steel ship should have been sweltering, well over 100 degrees. Bima unlatched the massive pressure door leading to the engine room. It groaned loudly, echoing through the empty space. The cavernous room was a graveyard of heavy machinery. The massive diesel engines were completely dead. But as the team swept their flashlights across the equipment, they realized the source of the unnatural cold. The The pipes, the catwalks, and the engine blocks were entirely encased in a thick layer of white, crystalline frost. "Command, you are not going to believe this," Arif spoke into his radio, his teeth chattering. "The engine room is frozen solid. I repeat, there is actual ice inside the hull." "Understood, Alpha. Find the ship's log and evacuate immediately. We do not like this." Commander Tariq's voice cracked through the static. While Senyo and Yudi held a defensive perimeter near the stairwell, Bhima and Arif moved toward the chief engineer's control booth. Inside the small, glass-paneled room, they found the ship's maintenance logbook lying open on the desk. Bhima shined his light on the pages. The entries from the previous days were entirely normal, documenting fuel pressure and generator output. But the final entry, written just hours ago, abandoned all technical jargon. The handwriting was frantic, the pen tearing through the paper. It read, "They did not come from the sea. We brought something up in the nets. The captain is gone. The first mate is gone. Do not look into the dark corners. It mimics their voices. It comes through the pipes." Before Bhima could process the terrifying words, the single, dying emergency light bulb in the control booth violently shattered. Total darkness consumed them. A deafening mechanical shriek echoed through the engine room, sounding like tearing metal. "Light discipline. Flashlights on." Bhima roared over the noise. The 4 beams of light cut through the freezing darkness, sweeping frantically across the frosted machinery. Then, the tapping began. It was no longer coming from just the ceiling vents. It was coming from the bulkheads, the floor plates, and the pipes surrounding them. It was a chaotic, rapid rhythm that suddenly synchronized. It mimicked the rhythm of an SOS distress signal, but it was being played backwards. "Lieutenant! Over there!" Seno yelled, pointing his rifle toward a dark corner of the lower catwalk. In the periphery of the light, they saw it. It was not a pirate. It was a pale, elongated silhouette, completely devoid of hair or features, clinging upside down to the frozen pipes. Its limbs were unnaturally long, possessing too many joints. As the light hit it, the entity did not flinch. Instead, its jaw unhinged, dropping impossibly low, and from its throat came the exact, perfectly replicated voice of Medic Yudi. "Lieutenant! The coffee! It is still piping hot!" The sheer psychological horror broke their discipline. Senyo opened fire, his assault rifle deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flashes briefly illuminated the room, revealing that there was not just one creature. There were dozens of them, clinging to the shadows, crawling out of the ventilation shafts, their pale skin blending with the frost. "Fall back! Back to the stairs!" Bhima ordered, grabbing Arif by the shoulder and dragging him toward the exit. They scrambled up the metal grating of the stairwell, slipping on the ice. The sound of wet slapping footsteps rapidly pursued them. The creatures were incredibly fast, navigating the complex machinery like arachnids. As they reached the 3rd deck corridor, a heavy maintenance hatch suddenly slammed down from the ceiling directly between Senyo and Yudi. The medic was cut off. "Yudi!" Bhima screamed, throwing his weight against the iron hatch. It wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been welded shut from the other side. From behind the heavy steel, they heard Yudi's terrified screams, but the screams only lasted for 3 seconds before they abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. Then, slowly, the heavy metallic tapping resumed from the other side of the door. And then, Yudi's voice echoed through the metal, completely flat and devoid of emotion. "0 contacts. We are making entry. Proceeding to the mess hall." "He is gone. We have to move now," Senyo yelled, pulling the lieutenant away from the hatch. The three remaining men sprinted blindly through the labyrinth of the ship, their lungs burning, adrenaline pushing them beyond exhaustion. The ship itself seemed to be turning against them. Heavy blast doors began sliding shut on their own accord. The temperature continued to plummet. They finally burst through the exterior watertight door, stumbling out into the humid, tropical night air of the main deck. The sudden change in temperature hit them like a physical blow. "Command! We need immediate extraction! Man overboard! We are taking casualties!" Bhima screamed into his radio as they sprinted toward the rope ladder. The patrol boat was already moving in, its powerful searchlights cutting through the fog, illuminating the rusted hull of the freighter. Tariq's crew provided covering fire, aiming their heavy-mounted machine guns at the dark doorways of the ghost ship, though they couldn't see what they were shooting at. Bhima, Senyo, and Arif dove into the rigid inflatable boat, frantically cutting the mooring lines. As they sped back toward the safety of the naval vessel, Bhima looked back at the Malacca Star. The ship was no longer silent. The entire vessel was vibrating with a low, unnatural hum. Through the dirty, salt-stained portholes of the main deck, Bhima could see them. Dozens of pale, featureless faces pressed against the thick glass, watching them leave. And standing right in the center, behind the glass of the captain's bridge, was a figure wearing Medic Yudi's uniform. The boarding team was immediately quarantined upon returning to the patrol boat. Exactly 1 hour after they had evacuated, the Malacca Star suffered a sudden, massive internal explosion. The fire raged fiercely, burning with a strange, brilliant blue intensity. The ship quickly took on water and sank to the dark depths of the Malacca Strait, taking whatever nightmare lived inside it down to the abyss. The official naval report classified the incident as a pirate ambush, leading to a catastrophic engine failure and fire. Medic Yudi was listed as lost at sea. But the three men who survived that night knew the terrifying truth. The ocean had not taken their friend. The ship did. So what are we looking at here? Let us break this down logically. The initial assumption made by the Navy, piracy, seems like the most rational explanation. The Malacca Strait is infamous for hijackings. Pirates could have boarded the Malacca Star, killed or abducted the crew, and laid a trap for any responding naval patrols. But the evidence from the boarding team directly contradicts this. Pirates operate for profit. They steal cargo, take hostages for ransom, and strip the ship of valuable equipment. They do not leave a vessel entirely intact, and they certainly do not leave freshly cooked, warm meals on the dining tables. Furthermore, how do we explain the physical impossibility of the engine room? A heavy layer of frost inside an enclosed steel compartment in the middle of a tropical, humid ocean climate defies the laws of thermodynamics. Skeptics and marine investigators might point to something far more insidious, yet entirely natural: a severe chemical or gas leak. Many cargo ships carry hazardous materials. A massive leak of carbon monoxide or a refrigerant gas from the ship's cooling systems could explain the sudden drop in temperature. More importantly, prolonged exposure to high levels of carbon monoxide is known to cause severe auditory and visual hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a distorted sense of time. Could the original crew of the freighter have succumbed to gas poisoning, suffered mass hysteria, and thrown themselves overboard? Could the naval boarding team, already on edge and operating in an incredibly stressful, claustrophobic environment, have inhaled the same leaking gas? The tapping in the walls could simply have been the thermal expansion and contraction of the ship's cooling metal. The pale creatures they saw in the dark could have been nothing more than the frost-covered machinery distorting into monsters in their poisoned, panic-stricken minds. It is a highly plausible scientific explanation, but it fails to answer one terrifying question. If the creatures were just hallucinations caused by gas, what exactly pulled Medic Yudi behind that heavy iron door, welding it shut with a force no human could muster? The official records have been sealed, but the mystery remains floating in the dark. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around here for the after action and the credits. You know, whenever I read these maritime stories, it always gives me a profound sense of unease. I never served in the Navy myself, but my uncle spent 20 years as an engineer in the Coast Guard. He spent thousands of hours out on the open water, performing search and rescue operations in some of the most unforgiving weather conditions imaginable. He always told me that the ocean does things to a man's mind. He used to say that when you are hundreds of miles away from shore, staring out into the pitch-black horizon at 3 in the morning, the silence becomes so heavy that your brain starts inventing sounds just to cope. I remember him telling me a story about a derelict fishing trawler his cutter intercepted off the coast. They boarded the vessel because it was adrift in a shipping lane, much like the ship in tonight's story. He said the boat was completely empty, but the radio was still broadcasting an automated weather loop. The creepiest part? He swore that down in the sleeping quarters, they found a notebook where the captain had written the same phrase over and over again on every single page. The water is looking back at me. They eventually towed the boat back to port, and the authorities concluded the crew had likely been swept overboard during a squall. But my uncle always maintained that the feeling he got on that boat was one of absolute suffocating dread. He refused to ever go down into the lower decks of an abandoned ship again. It makes you wonder how much we actually know about what lies beneath the surface of the deep blue. Thank you for listening, watching, and subscribing. Anything and everything you guys do to support the channel goes a long way, and our team sincerely appreciates it. May God be with each and every one of you, no matter what you are dealing with. And I will see you in the next episode.